your patience. And thank you online for your patience too. For the first time ever, the Wi-Fi just didn't like the button that we pressed. It's been sorted out and we're here. And we're going to start the event in the space with Khawla Badwan, who's going to read a poem for us.
They declared some safe zones, dropping leaflets of death maps with colours and webs of lines. They declared some safe zones, adding numbers to squares with messages of death threats. Leave or else, they warn. Run or else, they threaten. Move or else, they abuse. Running to safe zones, running in safe zones, running from safe zones, running out of safe zones. They engineered the death zones, people trapped between the lines, and bombs dropping everywhere. When I die, reads a child's wail. When I die, don't cry, this saddens me. When I die, give my clothes away to those in need. When I die, send my accessories to those names. When I die, donate my allowance and split it fairly. When I die, look after my brother, says the latter under the rubble. Will my legs grow back? Asks a crying child in Gaza, with fear on his face and sadness in his eyes. Will my legs grow back? Asking again, looking at me. Searching for lost hope, a promise of advanced medicine, a miracle, and I lose my eye contact. My cheerful voice breaks down. I see it shattered on the sandy road under the scorching sun. I look at the amputated legs, hiding my face away. If only limbs can grow back. I spot a football outside a tent. How can I hide this thing? I look at my legs. I look at his amputated legs. I look at the sky. The buzzing drones, and I ask, how far have the bombs traveled? Who sent them? Who developed them? Who paid for them? And the world becomes a violent web. And now you and you and you and you, we all have to respond. Will his legs grow back? To love the land even when it's burned. To love freedom even when it looks impossible. To love justice even when it's far away. To love the old house even when it's just rubble. To love the olives even when they are weeping. To love za'atar even when its smell hurts. To love kindness even when brutality is the norm. To love patience even when your pain is unbearable. To love love even when you are in pieces. To love hope even when you expect betrayal. Such is to practice love in a loveless world daily. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for attending the launch event of our new series, At the Edges of Languaging. We would like to start by acknowledging your presence in the room and on the live stream. We know being here is not easy. Being here requires a lot of courage, integrity, clarity, solidarity, and the very hard work of being present in the world and for the world. We know being here is not easy, but we also know that being here brings ease. Being here brings ease. This is because speaking truth clearly, even when it is painful, provides a palliative effect. We learn from psychologist Kristen Fisher that remembering and truth-telling, rather than causing re-traumatization, should be viewed as a significant component of projects of individual and social healing. We aspire to heal together, exist for one another while being in the company of words that provide the grounds for urgently needed energy for connection and for attention. We invite you to this space of humanness and newness at the edges and despite the edges. Ahlan wa sahlan bikum. Ahlan wa sahlan bikum. These are the words uttered in the tongue of my mother and my land, and I translate its message to you through my colonized yet reclaimed tongue as I say, welcome to you all. Before I tell you the story of the edges of languaging, this new series that we're organizing here at the Poetry Library, I'd like to invite my colleague, my fellow educator and fellow inquirer, Becky Swain. Becky is the director of the Poetry Library, and we are here today thanks to all the hard work of Becky and her team. Becky, over to you.
Thank you to Khawla for starting the evening with poetry from your book. You'll tell us more shortly. Welcome to Manchester Poetry Library, both here and online. We are at Manchester Met University in the heart of the city, and if you don't know us already, and there's lots of faces I don't recognise, you can join as a member of the public. You don't need to be a student or staff member here. You can take out books. We've got a multilingual collection, a collection for children, and although we look a bit like an event space tonight, actually it's usually filled with shelves of books. It's like a blank canvas that we change around for whatever we need it for. So visit our website. You can sign up to a program of research events and workshops. So we're expecting no fire alarm if we do get one, just outside the way you came in and through the main entrance into the square. If you need the toilets while you're here, you've probably found them just outside on the right. So we wanted to start by telling you a little about how this event series came to light. Khawla Badwan is a reader in Applied Linguistics and co-lead for the Manchester Centre for Research in Linguistics at Manchester Met. Her expertise includes language education, intercultural communication, social justice, and language in times of unspeakability. Khawla's also a colleague of mine, and we've been having questions in the Grove Cafe between the different kinds of work we do about poetry, reading, writing, and care in education for some years now. I admire her work and deep sense of social justice, and we've been seeking ways to collaborate. So when, after October 23, Khawla began writing a poem a day bearing witness, and then publishing her anthology, Keep Telling of Gaza, been described as a beautifully painful call and response poetry book, we met again. We shared our sense of frustration at how, as humans, we stumble with language to explain the unthinkable and the horrific. We talked about how we might find spaces for dialogue, responding to this challenge, perceiving language as an active verb. We didn't know what shape it would take, and in a way we were trying to find our feet at the edges of language ourselves. In October last year, we were connected by Annie Hirsch and Jane Brake, who are just sitting here, and their connection to a charity called the Amos Trust, a creative human rights organisation committed to challenging injustice, building hope and positive social change. And Annie and Jane told us of the sad news of the destruction of the Edward Said Library, which is a library in Palestine that was created, the first English language public library, created in 2017. And as part of working with the Amos Trust, Annie and Jane have been exploring how they might support the Palestinian poet Mossab Abu Toha with a dream of rebuilding that library. He spent many years collecting the books that were housed in it. So wanting to create connections to our library, we met and had an open conversation about what happens when a library is reduced to rubble. Can we rebuild it? How? We wondered whether we could create a space at least for responses, and we knew it was important that it wasn't a one-off event but a series of conversations, navigating a path to new responses. That's how we ended up here today, with the first in a series that will focus on Khawla's poetry and writing, and a chance to reflect on and discuss some of those questions. So there'll be a chance to answer some questions yourselves with a bit of reflective time. It won't just be listening to us talking. And then there'll be time for discussion at the end. But we hope these events combine poetry, art, stories. There might be people here this evening who have suggestions for future events. And they centre care and solidarity with communities and populations that are harmed by the horrors of explosive violence. So we plan more events in December and April, and we'll share the details, as usual, on the event page for the Poetry Library. Just thanks for joining us. We really mean that, and Khawla really meant that from the heart. Thank you for finding yourself here. And I'm going to hand over to Khawla to tell her story.
Thank you so much, Becky. Becky told you the story of how this series has come together, and I'm going to tell you the story of the edges of languaging, which is the theme that this series is hosting. This story is documented in an academic book coming soon with Cambridge University Press. The book is called Still Gaza, Language in Times of Unspeakability. The story explores the edges of languaging, but this is not a heroic story. There is no heroism here. The story doesn't have a neat ordering of events. It doesn't have an ending, nor will it ever have an ending. The story is an ongoing endeavor, like all of us trying to find language, trying to respond with the words that humans often rely on to respond to events in life. It is a story about languaging grief, but what is particular about this type of grief, the Palestinian grief, is that it is grief that is deemed by many as too political, too complicated, too risky to acknowledge. It is rarely responded to with what we know of words of comfort that humans once used to extend as acts of care to one another. And this is where it gets really tricky. When humans hesitate to care, be scared. When humans refuse to notice, be scared. When humans adore ignorance, be scared. When humans worship their privilege, be scared. So this kind of work is rooted in a kind of intercultural education that is based on the human experience, with its richness, complexity, messiness, brokenness, limitations, and paradoxes. It is an intercultural education that is not only contemporary and current, but is also hard, lived, felt, breathed, embodied, and experienced. It refuses to see academic knowledge as abstract theories developed in books, but it insists on looking at academic scholarship as a form of knowledge that sits with the mess, that acknowledges the mess in the world, as we're living in times characterized by varying degrees of failure, defeat, heartbreak, dehumanization, and betrayal. The story starts with questions, as any story does. How do I respond? How do I prepare a response? How can I sustain a response? How do I hold a response that is safe, that is possible, that is different, that is sayable, that is memorable, that is moving, that is shaking, that is responding, and that is utterly, utterly breathtaking. How do I present a response with the usual scholarly confidence that I am trained to perform in as an academic when it's not time for stable tonality, but it's time of cries, of outrage, of words that cut hearts in pieces in harmony with all the shredding that is taking place on our screens? What do I do when all words are said, when language is looted, when truth-telling is under attack, when learning is hard, and when silence is not golden? Practically and ethically, we need to acknowledge that the tools we currently have are not enough. They're unable to hold, unable to externalize thoughts that are often deemed as unthinkable. And for that reason, we need to find new ways of language. And that's why I think about language as a verb rather than a noun, languishing. We need new ways of languishing our grief, our struggle, our worries, our anxiety, and the indifference that characterizes many domains of our life today. We need new language outside established academic and educational conventions that are so used to sterile objectivity, selective morality, and decontextualized neutrality. And this is the essence of working with and at the edges of languaging. Walter Brueggemann cautions us against what he calls a prose world. A prose world is a world that is organized around settled formulae and reduced truth. Instead, he advocates for something called a poetry world. He doesn't mean by a poetry world, he doesn't mean rhyme, rhythm, and meter. He means a form of language that moves, a form of language that makes possible, a form of language that opens wide at the edges of alternatives, at the edges of poetic possibilities. So he asks, is there another way to speak? Is there another voice to be voiced? Is there an alternative universe of discourse to be practiced that will struggle with the truth in ways unreduced? So as you see, all the important things start with lots of questions. How do I respond? My first response was a retelling of a phone conversation with my father, who is currently, with the rest of my family, are trying to survive in Gaza. My first response was a cry in the form of a poem. I wrote it on the 3rd of February 2024, and since then I've been writing almost daily. Here is my first response. He asks me not to worry. Darling, he says, we'll be fine. Our tent stood the test of rain. Our bread might last for another day. Our clothes are not that heavy, but fine. He asks me not to worry. Hey, he says, we still smile. We remembered your story, it made us laugh. Our faces know how to smile. He asks me not to worry. Listen, he says, we survived the night. The bombs were too close, we were ready to go. The bullets prepared us for a quick death. But here we are, talking to you again. Please don't worry, he says. The line starts to break. I could hear bombs. Dad, I said. And with this, I started to write poetic cries in response to events in Gaza, to observations from the world, to feelings about the futility of language, to comments on the power of language, to screams of mothers, children, fathers, and grandparents who themselves have lived the Nakba of 1948. I write almost daily as a worker with words, who knows that I have nothing but words, who knows that my words cannot hold, but I have nothing else to hold on. And with this, I have established a norm-defying genre. Call it poetry, call it a response, call it anything you want. That's the idea of the edges of languaging. It is a ritual of languaged witnessing, which is an art that is ethical, aesthetic, and political at heart. Now, the applied linguist in me remained fascinated by how people were responding to my poetry. In different iterations, people were saying, "Thank you for finding the words." So as an applied linguist, I found it interesting that people perceive words as things that are lost and they need to be found. And this is again part of this inquiry about the edges of languaging. How do we find words when language struggles to externalize what we are witnessing in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran, and in all these pockets of death worlds that are popping up around the world? Edward Said talks about Palestine as a human experience and a public popular will. He talks about our entanglement in struggle over geography. He says, "Just as none of us is outside or beyond geography, none of us is completely free from the struggle over geography. That struggle is complex and interesting, because it's not only about soldiers and cannons, but also about ideas, about forms, about images and imaginings. And this means that the edges of languaging is work for all of us, and it is also about all of us." We all have a duty to respond in various forms. You don't need to be a genocide scholar or a genocided scholar to speak up for the rights of the oppressed people, the Palestinian people, the Lebanese people, the Iranian people, and all the oppressed people who are deemed killable in global structures of necropolitics. You just need to be human with moral clarity and civic courage. There is no excuse to stay distant. A lot of people, and I hear it from a lot of people who say, "I don't know much. I am very distant from what's happening." And the response to that is, the Palestinians and the Lebanese nowadays, they're live streaming the intimacy of death, not to be told, "Sorry, I can't begin to imagine." They're live streaming the death, not to be told, "Sorry, it's complicated. I don't know enough about your history." Isabella Hamad offers a different response. She says, "Be like the Palestinians in Gaza. Say, 'You are me, and you are not alone.' And the minute you run that experiment, you look at your phone and you look at the grey faces on the screen and you say, 'You are me, and you are not alone,' it changes the relationship between the self and the other, which is the basic principle of any intercultural education. Now, we all have to do work. No one is exempt. But what does the work entail? A lot of people ask, what do I do? What does the work entail? There isn't a neat map for what the work entails. You need to train your voice. I shared with you my story with training my voice. Your story could be different, and it has to be different. But it starts with the willingness to train your voice, to find your language, to read the room, to recognize what's sayable, what's possible, what's doable, to understand that we all have different degrees of privilege, to understand the scope of possibility. We also need to accept that speaking up and standing up take different shapes. Some of us might be able to hold the mic because they can. Others can be the silent enablers who allow others to hold the mic and do the work and be part of the work. So when we say you have work to do, that work takes different shapes and different forms towards justice. The best metaphor I can think about is water. We need to be like water. Now, water is a curious thing. Water is soft, but water is strong. Water is capable of wearing down hard rocks. We need to be water. And now we need to breathe. We're going to have a 3-minute break. And during that break, we're going to hand out cards with a question that we would like you to think about and reflect on. You're welcome to write down responses. You're welcome to think about them. You're welcome not to do anything. But that is an opportunity for us to take a break and to think about language and what language does for us and for our world. The question on the card that I invite you to think about is, how can language be used to describe the unsayable? Becky is handing cards now. We have pens over here if you need to grab one. Can we have music in the room, please? 3 minutes. This reflection activity, the question we're thinking about here is, how can language be used to describe the unsayable? You're welcome to email us your response if you would like to share your response. The email to use is poetrylibrary@mmu.ac.uk. Thank you. thank you, everyone. There will be time at the end to share responses if you would like to share some of these responses. And I'd like you to leave our event today thinking about language and the unsayable in relation to lots of things. It doesn't have to be exclusively in relation to Palestine and Gaza and Lebanon and Iran and Sudan and Congo and all the horrors that we're witnessing in the world today. I'd like you to also think about language and the unsayable in relation to personal things in our lives. You know, moments when we experience things in our personal lives and we feel lost for words. So that is part of our inquiry at the edges of languaging, to explore the limits of language, but to also explore how we can stretch language beyond its limits in order to describe the unsayable. And I would like to invite you to think with me with the words of Walter Brueggemann, who talks about the idea of a poetry world, which isn't about rhyme and rhythm, but it is about the ability to find language to move others, to inspire others and transform change. So thank you for your reflections. Let's move on to think about language a little bit more deeply now. I'm going to share with you a few adjectives. You're welcome to write them down. You're welcome to just listen and think about them in relation to language and languaging. And these adjectives could help us, as we are collectively going on this inquiry, to understand how language can be used to describe the unsayable. So the adjectives are clarifying, creative, communal, inventive, intensive, intentional, laborious, loving, and liberating. And I invite you all to take these adjectives seriously. So if we're thinking about taking these adjectives seriously, we need to be open to experimenting and to failing. And experimenting and failing are really important for repair. So I started the event today by talking about social and individual healing and repair. Repair is about experimenting with tools until something finally works. Repair is about accepting failure and accepting that we need to act together, accepting that we need to be sensitive to the emotional and physical fatigue that comes with the work of repair. Working with these adjectives means going back to the very basic principles of being humans, particularly in the time of AI and machines and bots that pop up everywhere. It is important that we remind each other of what makes us humans: vulnerability, improvisation, trying, exploring, failing, falling, and shaking off the dust again. We might not always get it right, but this too is part of being human. And this too is what it means to live at the edges and despite the edges of language. So I'm not going to be one of these linguists who will come with a particular model to say, here is the model for how to live at the edges of languaging, because there is no model. And what is particularly important about the richness and the diversity of the human experience is that it is a kind of experience that defies any models. And that is what this inquiry that I'm inviting you to think alongside me to think about. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a couple of poems that focus on the work of language in times of divisions and genocidal horrors. I invite you to breathe with me as we think together of languaging at the edges. So in between every poem, I'm going to say, and now we breathe, because we need to breathe. So, and now we breathe. There are no words left. There are no words left. They were erased when the bombs fell on an ambulance full of rescuers that could not rescue. They evaporated with the girl in the car who uttered the words of hell before the helpers were murdered on the way. They were sentenced to silence when politicians dictated shame, withholding the ability to name, as Gaza, then Lebanon, are erased yet remain. Still, words gather still. Names are uttered still, in a life full of despite and still. And we breathe. And you said what has become the usual non-response. There are no words left. And you shrugged these heavy shoulders, aching with shame, before the tongue declared defeat again. There's nothing else to do, to say, to feel. Then comes a child, behind this dimmed screen, under your scrolling finger, speaking the words of all language, asking you, what now? And we breathe. All bridges in town are trembling. The wind of anger comes without thunder, but with cold breeze that knows how to freeze. Bodies keep moving faster, rushing to please the master. This air is filled with words trapped like caged birds. And this day, like the one before, is also passing through the door. There is no time left. We are living a grave theft. The wall. We thought the wall had fallen in a ceremony of celebrations, declaring lessons of hard-gained wisdom, and forgotten they've become, abandoned on dusty shelves whose backs are forever turned. The eyes see and unsee, walls pile up in minds before they cut across lands. Life is trapped in the maze of walls, with logic full of holes, and with the illusion of a wall that managed to fall. Instructions for surviving genocidal times. There is no hope. Be the action that restores hope. There is no justice. Be the voice that speaks of justice. There is no carriage. Be the witness that lives in carriage. There is no light. Be the holder that forces light. There is no mercy. Be the heart that teaches mercy. There is no language. Be the crafter that makes language. And the last one is called Lebanon. Death, die, hell, in hell, Gaza-like. This is how the empire speaks, after it demands obedience as the language of our time. Lebanon, the land of cedar, is bleeding under bombs, where mourners are murdered with no permission to mourn. It's another day of nothing to say, except silence on top of silence, with eyes closed and indifference exposed. And now we're going to hand more cards with another question about language. And we would like to invite you to reflect on this question for the next 3-4 minutes. The question is, what to do when the response is, there are no words left? People on the live stream, you're very welcome to engage with this reflection. The question again, what to do when the response is, there are no words left? You're welcome to email us your responses. The email address is poetrylibrary@mmu.ac.uk. Can we have some music in the room, please? It might be a good idea now to listen to some of your responses. If anyone would like to share any of the reflections to the two questions. So the first question, how can language be used to describe the unsayable? Or the second one, what to do when the response is, there are no words left. And as I shared with you earlier, there is no right or wrong response. We're looking for personalized reflections on language and life. We have a hovering mic if anyone would like to share any responses. And people on the live stream, you're very welcome to leave comments or to email us if you prefer to send a private note. So, what do we do with this thing called language in life? Yes.
So with the first question, I found it quite hard to write anything down for about a minute. And then I thought, well, what do I actually do in this situation? And the answer came, for me, we have to speak from our heart, listen to our dreams and nightmares, and then work out what feeling inside has somehow been created by those dreams and nightmares, and find some words to try and match them. And in the end, the feeling is, I don't and I can't accept that anything is unsayable. We have to say.
Thank you very much. And thank you for challenging the word unsayability and unsayable. I think that's important.
I was just wondering, this is more on the second question of what to do when the response is there are no words left. And I was just wondering, is that more because the silence is too comfortable? And have we become comfortable in this idea of there are no words left, so let's not talk about it? And I think we should push past that and make ourselves uncomfortable. And the whole point is, let's get out of our comfort zones, let's talk about what the problem is.
And what's amazing about the two reflections is both of the reflections are pushing against these common expressions. Who decides what's unsayable? And how can we know for sure that all words were said? Thank you. Any other reflections?
I responded with multiple answers. So to the first one, how can language be used to respond to the unsayable? I wrote as a form of protest, as a form of acknowledgement, as a form of being. Language, not only as a form of self, the voice, but as a form of ancestral roots. To me, the unsayable is the first, the step in knowing and the step in seeing. For when we say, when we are in the moment, we are breaking silence and speaking moments to time. Time and moments for now, then, future and past.
That is amazing, and you are redefining language through your responses, which is very powerful. And this is exactly what I said at the beginning by saying being a linguist, because in linguistics we're pretty much concerned on language and the self and the acquisition and the expression. We're starting to pay more attention to voice and roots and lands, but I think it is through these inquiries that we all have as a result of our lived experience with language that we can redefine these definitions, because who decides what language is? Who decides where language starts or where language ends? Thank you so much. That was a beautiful reflection. Any other reflections? Yes, Nima.
I mean, these are like two challenging questions, I must say. Because to me, unsayable is not the absence of language, but it's like the tension between what is said and what can be said, or what can be implied. So, yeah.
There is again another important discussion around the relationship between language and power. Absolutely. Maybe it is unsayable because it's too daunting to express. Maybe it is unsayable because we don't feel able or safe to express. Thank you, Nima. These reflections are really important, you see, because as we're reflecting together, we're challenging the language that we commonly hear, not only around Palestine, but also around anything traumatic. You know, anything traumatic, whether it's political or personal, there are certain cliches, certain expressions that we like to use to talk about language. And when we are sitting with the edges to sort of say, you know what, that doesn't work, we need to try a little bit harder, we need to try to stretch language beyond its limits, that's when suddenly language starts to acquire new meanings. Meanings that do not sit within models, and we need that. We need an understanding of language that roams in the human experience, which is exactly what we're trying to do with you. And now you see why we're doing this. It's hard. It's not easy, but it brings ease. because suddenly you start to feel grounded. You start to think about these expressions that are limiting your ability to use language through pushing them to sort of say, well, actually, hold on, who says there are no words left? Hold on, who says what is speakable, what's not, what's language, what's not? Thank you. I am learning a lot from your reflections. Do we have any more reflections or responses? Yes, Hasra.
Thank you. I'm going to go with the second one first, and maybe only. So, when my world broke apart, it was not only words that consoled, presence did too. But on the rare occasion someone used words combined in ways that made them heal, I felt, I sighed, I was seen, that was not taken away, but the vibration of the words combined healed. Words, presence, or both together made me feel, I sighed. There are no words left, are words, healing words. Sometimes they are all you have to say.
That is amazing. Did you write this on the spot?
Yes, poetry is my
So we have a poet. Thank you, Hasrat. That is amazing. And it's so important. I mean, we talked a lot about words and feelings, and your poem brings a new dimension, which is to be seen through language. And again, through personal suffering or political suffering, language is important in order to feel acknowledged and seen and present in the world. So we know what is at stake when no language is used, when no language is attempted. When no language is attempted, everything becomes unseen. And that's why we are struggling with life these days, because it feels like we're living in parallel worlds. You know, one world where nothing, almost nothing, is seen and acknowledged, but there is also something that is constantly happening. Thank you. Any other responses or reflections? Did you want to go back to the other question?
Something we can talk about. It was about how is that we say the unsayable without ourselves, because we are breaking barriers of what cannot be said, and the senses is not welcomed. So I was thinking, how do we say and penetrate that barrier without getting hurt ourselves, because that penetration can hurt.
Absolutely.
So what does self-care, maybe, is that a word we want to use?
Yeah.
How do we protect vulnerability in that? How do you do it, Khawla? Maybe you can tell us about that, because you are quite public, you are quite vulnerable. What does self-care look like in that instance?
That's a really beautiful comment, Hasrat. And I think if you ask particularly Palestinian psychologists who are trained in not post-traumatic stress, but they're trained in a lifelong stress that is passed, and not just stress, trauma, that is passed on from one generation into another. And they would say to, and I've learned a great deal from my fellow Palestinian psychologists who keep on reminding us that self-care is rooted in the ability to name injustices. We hear a lot of, again, Western models, and I like us to be pushing against these things that actually harm us rather than benefit us. There are lots of Western models around, stop watching the news, look after yourself. Maybe if you don't watch these videos, maybe you'll be better. It's not about you watching the videos, because atrocities happen whether you're watching or not. Self-care happens when you're able to see and be present and find the language to talk about these things. One of the hardest months or periods for me during the genocide in Gaza was the first 4 months when I didn't know what to say. And it was really hard. I tried everything. I even tried not watching the news, and nothing helped. What really helped was the ability to name, and it does take time to name. It does take time to establish a lexicon anchored in humanitarian law and legal language, so you know what you can say without getting yourself into trouble. And I think that's an important exercise that so many people, millions of people around the world have undertaken. People have taken unofficial degrees in Palestinian studies. And part of these unofficial degrees is not just knowledge about history, but also familiarizing ourselves with the language of humanitarian law. You know, how do we defend human rights? How do we say, even though you don't want me to talk about this, this is wrong. No human being should be subjected to this form of suffering. So I think self-care needs to be rooted in that ability to respond, because once you take response from someone, you take away their agency, and then they struggle to look after themselves. No meditation can heal. You can't sit under a tree and pretend that, you know, the world is green from this side of the world. We need to find our paths. And vulnerability is what makes us human. You know, humans are vulnerable. Humans die. Wherever they are in the world, you know, vulnerability is part of being human. And one of the exciting things about vulnerability is once we acknowledge that we are vulnerable, it's important to be able to do something about it. So Judith Butler talks about vulnerability and agency. She talks about how when you are agentive, you don't stop being vulnerable, but you're vulnerable and agentive at the same time. And it is through that, being agentive and vulnerable, that you can exercise self-care. Any other reflections in the room? That's fine. Please keep reflecting, keep thinking. You're welcome to write to me. My email address is in the public domain, so you're very welcome to write to me. You're very welcome to write to the Poetry Library email address. And we would love to do this together throughout the different events in the series, because this is a collective inquiry on the role of language and on what language does. And now I'm going to move with some concluding remarks. My eldest is 12 years old. I asked him when he was 10 years old, so in the early days of the genocide in Gaza, I said to him, tell me something about Gaza. Yeah, so this is a 10-year-old responding, and he said, Gaza has shown the world what the world was not ready to see. And I thought that was the most philosophical response you could ever get. And to think of that from a 10-year-old, I was daunted by the beauty and the richness and of that response. So the follow-up from Gaza has shown the world what the world was not ready to see is, how do we then move forward with this wounded realization of the world? We are living with wounds. There is no way of denying it. And I think acknowledging what we are living, it's just like when you go to see the doctor, you know there is something wrong, but you don't know what is wrong. When the doctor gives you a diagnosis, no matter how painful the diagnosis is, the diagnosis puts you at ease. You know why you have been ill. Language is something similar to that. So language has a palliative power if you're able to name what's happening. And that goes us back to your question, Hazrat, about self-care. When we're able to name what we are going through, to describe the world, to describe our feelings, to describe our voice, our frustration, it brings an element of, I wouldn't call it therapy because there is no therapy, but it provides a palliative effect. And this is why language is really important. So how do we move forward with this wounded realization? It is important to acknowledge that we're living with wounds. And this is part of the diagnosis. We can't just pretend that it doesn't affect me, so everything is okay. It is important to name these wounds. And these wounds have different names in different parts of the world. But some of the wounds that I'm going to name now are global. So some of these wounds are erosion of trust. Look around you. Look at the relationship between individuals, between institutions, between sectors. We're living a time where trust is eroded. Another wound is moral injury. Moral injury happens when you lose faith in systems and policies and procedures, when you lose faith in people around you. So moral injury is another wound that we are living with. We're also living with psychological unsafety. One of my close friends referred to this as, it feels like we're living while watching over our shoulder wherever we go. So that is another wound, psychological unsafety. But we're also living with collective trauma. Humanity was never prepared to see this. It's not just the Palestinians in Gaza, not just the Lebanese in southern Lebanon who are being traumatized and killed. We are also collectively traumatized in witness with what's happening. Other wounds include scarred relationships. Again, look around you. A lot of people will tell you about relations that were lost over what is happening in Palestine, in Gaza, about naming the world for what is happening. Other wounds include ruptures and tensions and the demise of social contract. So there is a lot. And that's why we need language. And that's why Vicky and I thought we can't have a one-off event to say, this is what the Edges of Languaging is about. We have a long-term social and collective endeavor ahead of us as we're trying to language these wounds and as we're trying to understand how do we then live our lives with these wounds. There can be no healing without working with compassion and centering struggle at the root of the mind. Williams talks about this idea of creative practice as the struggle of the root of the mind. And I'd like to say that really your responses today have been a really good example of the collective struggle at the root of the mind. Because we're struggling with the language around us, and we are pushing against that language, and we're trying to find new ways to language what we are witnessing, using and centering our own experiences. So this is all creative practice that centers struggle at the root of the mind. We need to work together with critical racial literacy. And that's why it's important that we're hosting this inquiry at a university and as part of the Poetry Library, because this is, after all, an educational inquiry. And when I say education, education is in every part of the world and in every domain of life. Education isn't just about mainstream education and institutions. We get education everywhere around us. So this is at the root of an educational project. We need to work together with critical racial literacy to understand how race is embedded within the struggle for an education that attends to the world and dares to name the world in order to transform it. We also need to work with our possibilities. We need to understand what we can do. We need to uncover the chains around our tongue and around our ability to use language. My colleague and very close friend Hasrat always says to me, I'm not just an educator, and that is true. We are not just educators. We are world makers and workers with words. Look around you. Young people are scared and vulnerable, insecure, and financially deprived. When the present looks dark, the future remains scary. And that's why we're not doing this work only for ourselves. We're doing this for the young generation, for children and young people who are looking at us right now with lots of questions. And in most cases, they're not given any responses. So that's why it is important to think about the power of language and education and how we can make better words and better worlds. I would like to cite the very wise words of my colleague David Gramling, who says, "We were not allowed and never would be to stop wanting a wantable and wantably just and peace-adoring future, nor to stop building together what we needed for that future." He says, "Heartbreak was ours. A heartfelt sadness was ours, but despair was not. Resignation was not." So to say, I am going to practice self-care and resign is not ours. Despair is not ours. This is not what humans should be doing. And finally, I would like to end with the very wise words of Mahmoud Darwish, who wrote a letter back in 1973. 1973, he wrote a letter called Silence for Gaza. And there are 2 lines in that letter that says, "Because in Gaza, time is something different. Because in Gaza, time is not a neutral element." And every time I read these 2 lines and think, wow, from 1973. The letter was called Silence for Gaza. So in my book, I wrote an entire book to respond to the letter and to say, this letter proved to outlive time, because it is true that time in Gaza is different. Time in Gaza is not a neutral element, but while silence for the sake of Gaza was meant to honor her, silence is no longer an appropriate ritual of mourning in times of unspeakability. So I conclude my book with this poem that I want to read with you. And it says, "Dear Gaza, I disrupt the silence where my mourning lives, lest I become complicit in the crime of erasing you. With you I carry the weight of words for the mention of a people without rights. I assemble my words in work on unspeakability for you and with you, declaring again, yet again, it is still Gaza, humanity's eternal heartbreak." I know this evening has left most of us feeling heartbroken. We know that. But I also hope that this evening and the inquiry that we are inviting you to take part in is also making you feel grounded. So we can be heartbroken and grounded. And these are exactly the conditions we need for a poetry world, for a world that breaks open new possibilities for goodness and newness. And this is what we will be exploring further in this series at the edges of languaging. We will meet again in December, and then later in April we will announce the details of our event, of these sessions and what they will entail. But we've given you a flavor now of what we will be doing together. We will be inquiring about language and the role of language in our lives. The purpose is not to come up with neat models. We are anti-neatness. The model and the target isn't a model. The target is to explore language in relation to the human experience. And we're dealing with one of the most difficult and daunting experiences that humans could ever live through. The last poem for tonight is called Past Tense, and I hope we will all leave this evening thinking about this poem, Past Tense. One day that is not here yet, we will use the past tense announcing the fall of this evil. One day that is not here yet, we will use the past tense announcing the fall of this evil. We shall teach our children how humanity survived, how our memory, history, language, order, and hope had miraculously made it through all the traveling bombs. And we shall hold them dear and hold them tight. One day, the past tense of the very far future that speaks of this present shall become victorious. Until we write in the past tense, we sit in the present, struggling together at the edges of languishing, in compassion against this forced amnesia. We struggled together. We struggled together, some of us shall say, with the heaviest use and the hardest use of the past tense. Thank you very much, everyone, and until next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Collective endeavour that can mean all kinds of things, I think. Thank you for giving your time to answering the questions, the very, very difficult questions that were posed. We mentioned messaging us, so Khawla, if you wanted to continue a conversation, and also the Poetry Library is just poetrylibrary@mmu.ac.uk. The next event is the 10th of December and the 29th of April. At the same time, in person or online as well. Just please show your appreciation again for Khawla. This is the beginning of an inquiry that's an extension of your already deep inquiry. So thank you for hosting your conversation here. Thank you very much.